Thank you, Erica, and thank you for joining us today for our 6th iteration of Colby College's 2026 in the News lineup. I'm Sama Fatah, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Matthew Yglesias. Matthew Yglesias stands out as a leading political writer of his generation who combines a commitment to pragmatism and a focus on data-driven, actionable policy solutions. He began his national political journalism career during the early 2000s, where he worked as the money bag columnist for Slate and contributed to Think Progress, The Atlantic, TPM Media, and The American Prospect. Yglesias later co-founded the revolutionary news site Vox in 2014, along with Melissa Bell and Ezra Klein. After leaving Vox in 2020 to achieve greater editorial freedom and return to his early days of blogging roots, Yglesias launched the independent, slow-boring newsletter on Substack and co-founded the weekly Politix podcast, where he discusses the 2024 election, American politics, and public policy with Brian Beutler. Alongside his work in journalism and podcasting, Yglesias is the author of several books, including 1 Billion Americans, which encourages people to think big about America's long-term future. In a media environment reliant on instant reactions, hot takes, and headline-ready drama, Matthew Yglesias flips the script, focusing on thoughtful analysis and a willingness to challenge easy answers and orthodoxies across the political spectrum. Hosting us today are our moderators, Associate Professor of Government Carrie Levan and Colby Senior Bryn Robbins. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Yglesias on stage.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and especially to Matt for making the journey from DC to Waterville, which under normal conditions is not a very easy journey, and especially under a partial government shutdown. So thank you very much for being willing to be here with us in person.
That's my pleasure.
Yeah, and so tonight we're going to be talking a lot about politics and strategy, and specifically about the Democratic Party and what can Matt tell us about a winning strategy potentially for the Democrats, right? And so I want to start by kind of thinking about what you think is a winning strategy. And as a political scientist, political scientists, strategists, pundits, et cetera, they all tend to fall into one of two camps. And so those of you who've taken Intro to American Politics with me, you know what I'm talking about. But one camp tends to argue that the winning strategy is that candidates should moderate their position, they should get to the middle, and this strategy allows them to persuade independent or swing voters, right? So they expand their base in this way. And the second camp tends to argue that you should really buckle down, that you should be true to your base, and that you should maybe even double down on issues that are really important to your base so that you can excite them and really rally the base and maximize turnout, right? And so those tend to be the two camps. And so what do you think is the winning strategy, or do you think that there's a third pathway?
Sure. I really think that sort of traditional persuasion, moderation, trying to appeal to swing voters, trying to appeal to crossover voters has become underrated in American politics. It's not that mobilization doesn't matter, it's not important. And I would give sort of three reasons for that. One is just mathematically, swinging one person is twice as potent as mobilizing one non-voter. That's just how the numbers work. The second thing is that the trade-off, I think, is not necessarily what people think it is. If you look at sporadic voters, they are less ideologically consistent than regular voters. It doesn't necessarily mean they're like middle of the road on every issue, but they tend to be people who feel conflicted between the two parties, and that's one reason why they don't vote. I mean, I think about my father-in-law. He was a Republican all his life, really didn't like Donald Trump. Today, he voted for Kamala Harris. He's a Democrat now. But in 2016, he couldn't bring himself to vote for Hillary Clinton, But so he just didn't vote, right? That was him going halfway between being a Republican and his new identity as a Democrat, is he was a non-voter or sporadic voter for a little bit. The other thing is that I think that a lot of people, especially educated people who care a lot about politics have a hard time imagining swing voters because they don't know a lot of swing voters. They may know that some people disagree with them about politics, but the idea of people who are just conflicted or murky sounds like fake to a lot of people I know. And I'm really glad to be here in Maine talking about this. I spent a lot of time in this state over the years, and I've always been impressed by the fact that you have in Maine lots of people who voted for Kamala Harris, voted for Joe Biden, voted for Barack Obama, but also voted for Susan Collins. You also have a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump and also voted for Jared Golden. You have some people who are Golden Collins, crossover voters, things like that. And this is just like a real thing that exists. Those kinds of crossover voters have become rarer on the ground in America. But I think that's largely because the parties have stopped nominating the kinds of people like Collins and Golden who can make those crossover votes happen. And there's a trade-off in that too. I mean, people have their principled objections to those kinds of politicians, which is fine, but there's a trade-off, and now that Representative Golden is stepping down, I think it's very unlikely the Democrats will be able to hold that House seat. But he was able to hold it down, and there are more seats that the parties could contest if they had more independent-minded elected officials getting the nomination.
Thank you so much. So you've just been talking about how underrated moderate candidates are for Democratic electability, especially. So I'm wondering, what does an exciting moderate look like to you? I know that's a little bit of an oxymoron. And who are some examples in the party right now that we could look to?
Yeah, I mean, this becomes an interesting question, right? Because a lot of people feel that the only figures who can sort of be exciting are the kind of biggest bomb throwers, that are out there. I think, though, that that's not baked into the cake necessarily. That, when Barack Obama came onto the scene in the 2008 primary, he was the preferred candidate of a lot of the more moderate members of the Democratic caucus at that time. I remember Max Baucus, other people from the Plains were pulling for Obama, simply because, he seemed like more of a fresh face, and he went out of his way to try to portray himself as an independent thinker, but he was also seen as exciting. John McCain, when he ran in 2000, was seen as a very exciting kind of outside force, as well as a more moderate sort of Republican. So, some of this is, I think, like a lack of creativity and imagination on the part of the moderates themselves. When I was talking to some of the Blue Dog House members, not Jared, and I was saying, I wish you guys would get out there more and do more press and be more visible, be on social media, try to be interesting, try to be exciting. And, they were saying to me, well, our thing is really, I just try to keep it local. I try to stay out of this sort of thing. And that's an old-fashioned political strategy, I think, for a world that doesn't exist anymore, in which people are reading their local newspapers. If a newspaper still exists in your town or city, I mean, God bless, but also nobody under 40 is reading that, probably nobody under 50. And so whatever kind of politics you want to do, you have to find a way to make it work with the modern communications methods. I try to preach that gospel to the more moderate people out there, and I'm hoping. If Bobby Polito gets elected to Congress, he's going to be a big star.
Can you tell us more about who Bobby Polito is?
So Bobby Polito is a Tejano music star. He won a Latin Grammy this year. He's running in a red seat in Texas and in South Texas. It's been gerrymandered quite badly. But it's a seat that was historically Democratic. There's been a big swing of those South Texas Tejano voters toward Trump. Bobby, he's just got a ton of charisma, because he's a musician. He's a really fun guy. He's done some really good podcast appearances. He's starred in music videos, things like that. But he's also he's quite moderate, he talks about being an old school common sense Democrat. It's a pitch that's it's on the one hand, it's very different from Jared's because it's a different part of the country, but it's the same kind of idea, an idiosyncratic part of the country where people used to be Democrats, where they've fallen out of love with some of the more urban, progressive kind of vibes. But he's just a guy who has a ton of charm, and if he wins this election, it'll be in an R+7 seat, so it'll be notable, but he's really somebody who's going to go viral and go out there, so I'm excited.
So I want to bring the electability discussion
Yeah.
a little bit closer to the party level now. So in your recent New York Times article a couple weeks ago, you talked about party flexibility a little bit and actually brought up Trump as an example of somebody who's really shifted the Republican Party's platform towards the center. So that was so intriguing to me.
People obviously don't think of Donald Trump as a moderate in politics, and because in a lot of ways he isn't. There's a lot of behavior he engages in that's quite extreme. On another level, though, I mean, I try to remind people, if you look at students will not remember the 2012 campaign, but I promise you that what happened in that campaign is that Democrats hammered Mitt Romney for wanting to cut Medicare. That was the number one most potent issue that Democrats wielded against him. Trump's response to that in 2016 was to change Republicans' position, to say, it's dumb. We shouldn't be losing elections over this Medicare issue. There's more important things to fight for. In 2022, after the Dobbs decision came down, there was a huge backlash against that. Abortion rights was a big winning issue for lots of Democratic candidates. Trump said, you know what, we need to cool it on this abortion stuff. We're not going to move federal abortion legislation. So in 2024, that issue didn't work nearly as well for Democrats because people weren't as concerned about it. If he, he's doing a speech tonight, I think. If he in that speech was like, I changed my mind, we need to take action against the, however it is a Republican would characterize it, that would be a huge deal. People would counter-mobilize against it, but he took it off the table. Now he's doing other stuff, which is generating its own sort of counter-mobilization. But that's I think a bitter pill for political activists to swallow, but is that doing stuff is usually politically counterproductive. Now you do it anyway if you believe in the cause, right? But everything you put on the table, every cause you champion, that's just another opportunity to alienate people and to generate backlash. A lot of the most electorally potent people, like Senator Collins, it's she doesn't actually do all that much, and she's not exciting, but she's won a ton of incredibly difficult elections.
Are there some issues that you would like to see the Democratic Party have a little more flexibility on?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot of things related to race and ethnic identity where Democrats, I think they don't mean this, but I think they come across as not caring about working class white people. Because of, I remember seeing. Summer of 2020, and I was in Blue Hill, Maine, and there's Black Lives Matter signs. People are holding them downtown. Really cute, affluent liberal coastal town. You go 2 towns inland to Penobscot, and there's guys living in busted trailers, and they don't want to hear about how privileged they are, because they're not, right? And the classic Democratic Party, who people like that voted for, was seen as championing their interests. There's also things related to energy, which is incredibly important to people. They want to be able to heat their homes in the winter and to keep the lights on. And if you are seen as caring more about the environment than about affordable energy, that costs you with a lot of people. It costs you with people in oil and gas states, but also with people who are just struggling to make ends meet and really care about those costs.
So you brought up this question about the fear of alienating potential voters. And so when I think about the Democratic Party, right, it is a really diverse coalition. Absolutely. In terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, all of that. And so, one of the concerns with moderating, especially on some of these issues that you're bringing up, is that you fear that you may end up alienating a key portion of your coalition. And one of the issues that comes to my mind is the issue around trans rights, right? So trans athletes. We know that issue is not popular amongst the general population. Democrats have sort of said, we are going to support trans rights. And the concern is that if Democrats moderate on an issue like this, that's not popular, that they risk alienating a key portion of their coalition, that is LGBTQ plus voters who are, right, these are activists, they're donors, they're high propensity, and also potentially young voters who this is a really important issue to them. And you can, lose elections when you decrease turnout, even by small margins.
You can,
right?
and
So
I mean,
how do they strike that
right.
balance?
I mean, ultimately, you need a whole ecosystem that functions. And I think again, going back to even more ancient history, in the 2008 presidential election, right? Then Senator candidate Obama ran, and he was against same-sex marriage equality. He said he was for some civil union compromise type thing. I was young back then. Young Democrats at that time were very solidly for marriage equality. Obviously, like gay and lesbian Americans wanted equal rights for themselves. That was an important, in some ways, a more important donor group back then than it is now. And, people in those organizations had a choice to make, which wasn't that they were going to stop advocating for themselves, but they had to ask, did they want to spend the campaign dragging their feet, creating problems, making it harder for Obama to win? Or did they want to acknowledge that Obama was with them on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, Obama was with them on employment non-discrimination, that Obama's judicial nominees would probably be more sympathetic to their causes, and also that losing the election would only generate more fear, and more backlash around this issue. And I think at that time, by and large, Human Rights Campaign, other gay rights organizations were like, you know what? We are going to support the candidate who is better on our issues. And we are going to try to do the work ourselves of persuading the public that we are correct about the marriage thing. And that's what happened. Obama won. In his first term, some important progress was made on certain LGBT issues, but also progress was made on public opinion on the marriage issue. And once the poll numbers for that got above 50%, suddenly Democrats started flip-flopping, as fast as you possibly could. And so I think that some of that division of labor has broken down a little bit in recent years, where activists and advocates want to feel that it's the job of politicians to do the persuasion work. But that's very challenging. Politicians are not that persuasive to independent-minded people, to people who are in the other party. And if you think about how did opinion change on the marriage issue, Ellen DeGeneres and Queer Eye for the Straight Guy and these other things that happened in culture, I think moved voters more. It can be a tough calculus. It's easy for me to say on an issue that's not mine specifically, but that's why I use that example, because I think that we've seen over time that progress has usually happened because people realize that it's in their own interests sometimes to take a more pragmatic approach on issues that do impact them, precisely because the stakes do get very high.
Yep. Can I just say one, kind of push back just a little bit?
Please.
So the one thing that occurs to me is just thinking about, absolutely the pragmatism and the activism and the role of activists, but also thinking about the important role that insiders, politicians, play in helping to persuade the public as well. And I'm thinking back to civil rights, where things like integration, voting rights for Black Americans, employment opportunities for Black Americans, these things were not popular. Not in 64, not in 1957 when the Democrats passed the first Civil Rights Act, 1957. Public opinion switches on these after 64, after 65. At least the North Chicago polls show that public opinion followed major legislation. And so it was a combination, certainly, of the civil rights movement, but also the idea that insiders, politicians, people who people trusted, said, we're going to take this. And public opinion, even on gay marriage, Obama switches in May 2012. Public opinion really starts to skyrocket. It was already upward trajectory, but it was about 50-50 in 2012. It really starts to skyrocket.
Well, so I want to push back a little on it. So if you look at marriage, right, it's a linear march upward. The only year when it regresses is 2012. Right? It takes a minor step back when Obama comes in and polarizes it. The civil rights era is really fascinating because it was such a different time in terms of how partisan politics was organized in the United States of America. That you had all the Southern segregationists were
Yep.
Democrats, but also the leading advocates for civil rights were also Democrats. You had Republicans who were mostly favorable to civil rights, but didn't really want to do anything about it, and they were torn amongst themselves. I read a fascinating book about like the Eisenhower administration, and they were constantly torn between, should we try to win back black voters who FDR got, or should we try to win over Southern conservatives who, and they did both, right? And they put Earl Warren on the bench, but they also kind of winked at segregationists. And so I think that's like an incredibly important moment in American history, but probably not one that's all that instructive about how things work in a very polarized, very kind of organized sort of political landscape, because a lot of it wasn't partisan polarization in the same way though, right? So, if you look at like, what is the March on Washington trying to accomplish, right? And so the Kennedy administration has like committed itself to civil rights already. They've like said they're gonna do this, but they also have this whole other legislative agenda. And they have all these committee chairs who are from the South, and they're telling them like, no, don't do it. Right? And what the White House wants to do is just tell everybody that they're on their side
Yep.
and not actually do anything. And so what you're trying to do is just ratchet up the pressure and force the issue. And so it's either you're going to come out there and say to all these people, like, no, like I'm not going to lift a finger for you, or you're going to have to actually do it, right? And that's like a very real thing, very potent. I'm not sure we have an issue that has that dynamic right now.
Yeah, so I wanted to just, as a last question before we pass our questioning off to students, so we've been talking about electability concerns for divisive issues in the historical context a bit in the past few minutes, and so I just want to draw this to the upcoming midterm election in November. So how would you recommend Democratic candidates for this election cycle maximize their electability on divisive issues? And I know we've talked about like we haven't had divisive issues to that level, but I'm curious, do you think there are places where Democratic policies are truly out of lockstep with the American public?
Yeah, I mean, this varies a little bit, state by state, sort of what's relevant there. But if you look at, where the big Senate race is going to be here. So Alaska and Texas are two states with big oil and gas industries, right? And, I know Mary Peltola, who's running in Alaska, and James Tallarico is running in Texas. Like, they both know that. And Peltola, has served in the House. She's been very strong independent voice, knows how to do it. But the question is like, is she going to get backup from the National Party? Because when Joe Biden was president, he was under a lot of pressure from out-of-state environmental groups to do things with Alaska's management of its own natural resources that were not popular locally in Alaska. Similar issues in Texas. I think all across rural America, there are these questions about natural resource management, and local opinion like differs about these things in different places. In Maine, I think people, the voters have a more progressive view about these things. There's more of a conservationist, more of an environmentalist mentality in most of the state, but many issues with logging and other things like that. There was this big regulatory issue with the right whale and lobstermen that, again, in coastal Maine, people hated what the Biden administration was doing on that, and Representative Golden, kind of stood against it. So I think energy in those two states is going to be a big deal. I do think this issue about not about transgender rights writ large, but about specifically its application to areas like sports, where we practice sex segregation routinely, and where traditionally it had been seen as progressive to say like we need like women's sports as a separate but equal, kind of enterprise. I think like the polling on that is terrible, and I don't know. I mean, I don't want to tell people what they have to think or believe is important about different things, but I mean, how significant is that topic even to the larger landscape of rights for transgender people, and their access to employment, access to medical care? Because there's a lot of aspects of trans rights that I think are electorally viable. But to, lose votes over something that I think most Democrats will say, like, this isn't even that important, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, maybe you don't want to lose over it. Last but not least in this context is just the fact that the Biden administration was very unpopular. You know, that's different from when I was in college, Al Gore lost the election to George W. Bush. And Democrats, like, you know, they were in their feelings and they wanted to come back. But Bill Clinton was still popular, right? When Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama was still popular. So it was kind of easy to say, like, if you get sick and tired of this guy, like, we know what's going on. But after Biden, like, lots of people just lost faith in the, like, basic competence and governing ability of the Democratic Party, and candidates running for office in red areas need to have, like, something to say about that administration and how things went down there at the end, that shows independent-mindedness and shows that they are in touch with, you know, the sentiments of the majority of people about that administration.
All right, so we're going to turn it to the students, and I know we have, I think it's Leo, right? Nailed it. All right, so Leo's first, so take it away.
First of all, thank you so much for making the trek up here.
Oh, thank you.
Really glad to have you. My name's Leo. I'm a freshman economics and environmental policy double major. My question revolves a little bit about a speaker we had about a month ago. We had Graham Plattner here standing on that same stage. And when he was up here, you could feel the emotion, you could feel the frustration in his voice.
Yep.
And you could feel him really feeling the desire for change of the status quo that a lot of people around America have. And I think there are so many positives to the kind of moderation that you're describing, but it's also very difficult to satisfy that hunger for change. How do you suggest filling that gap?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think that something people can get confused about in their minds is that there's an incredible amount of disgust with the political establishment right now in America. And it's creating an opportunity for, like, real outsider candidates like Plattner to get a hearing with people. He's running in a contested primary in a blue state. So, like, it's also fine for him to be an outsider who's also just quite left-wing. But, you know, people who are running, there's Democrats, you know, contesting elections in places like Iowa, right? Now, you want some of that outsider energy, some of that I represent change, I represent a rejection of the status quo. But, like, the public opinion in Iowa is just still quite a bit more conservative than the public opinion in Maine. And if what you present to people is a vision of change that is exclusively left-wing change, like, that's just not going to work, right? Because part of what people don't like about the status quo is that they feel that both parties are very controlled by these kind of extreme interest group constituencies, right? Like, people think that if we didn't have corruption and donors and blah, 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 that people of goodwill should be able to sit around the table and, like, solve problems for America. What it is in their heads that, like, problem solving would look like varies quite a bit place to place, depending on what it is that people care about, and different kinds of things like that. When I first met Plattner last summer, before he was running for Senate, he was just he was shucking oysters at the Brooklyn General Store in coastal Maine, and then he ran, and I met up with him there, and you know, he was articulating early on, I think, a desire to be something other than just like a dogmatic leftist offering. And he has actually, like, a pretty moderate view on guns, I think. But, you know, I think that nationally you need some of that vibe, right? That, like, this is a guy, he's good at public speaking, he's handsome, he seems pretty smart, but he's not, like, part of the political machine. But then you need that to also exhibit some eclecticism, some independent-mindedness, some thoughtfulness, right? Because, like, just some guy from around the way is, like, probably not going to agree with 100% of a party platform that was cooked up, like, by these very same insiders.
So I know we have a second student, but I wasn't given the student's name. And there she rises.
Hi, thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm Kira.
Kira.
I'm a senior and a sociology major. And my question is about foreign policy. In 2008, you wrote a book arguing that Republicans' approach to foreign policy is driven by this aggressive nationalism and that Democrats have been too reactive and need to make a return to a liberal internationalism, as you put it. So I'm curious how you have seen each party's approach to foreign policy change in the years since.
Yeah. You know, I would have, 2 months ago, I think I would have had like a really hot take on this, which is that Trump is less changed than a lot of people think it is. Now I think after what we see happening in Iran, more people are coming around to that viewpoint. But there's this incredible continuity in thinking, which is that they want, George W. Bush and Donald Trump both wanted American power to be completely unconstrained by any notion of like rules or laws or norms. They have very different ideas as two different people as to like what exactly that unconstrained foreign policy should be doing. But like that's this through line, right, in conservative foreign policy thought. Democrats, I think, continue to be quite murky as to what it is they are actually saying. Because I think if you go to Washington, if you know people who are there, most people who are involved in Democratic Party politics don't care about foreign policy and national security issues. Then those topics are handled inside the party by like a set of professionals to whom like the work is outsourced. But they don't spend a lot of time thinking about like how do our positions like cohere with some kind of larger project that we're here and we're carrying out. This became very divisive, obviously, under the Biden administration with the war in Gaza, and is, you know, completely tearing the Democratic Party apart because there's such a fundamental disparity of views about the specifics of Israel and Palestine, right? But that, I think, just itself reflects the fact that there's very little actual consensus among Democrats as to what they want their foreign policy to look like. It's just mostly a political party of people who don't care that much about national security issues. And then when it does bubble to the top of the agenda, it's like you see this kind of meltdown.
Okay, so now we'll open it and we'll try to make sure we're moving around. I think I saw Aubrey first. It was like laser fast. So,
Hi, I'm Aubrey. I'm a junior. I'm studying government. I'm curious if in the time that you've spent analyzing the political landscape, whether or not any of your own beliefs have changed, and if so, how?
Yeah, many beliefs. I'm always changing my beliefs about things. Should I come? What do I really think? I'm trying to think one. You know, so I used to be much more optimistic about the politics of climate change. I used to consume a lot of information that was being put out by advocacy groups and stuff, indicating that like this was like a really like big deal issue to lots of people, that people were willing to do it. I think as like time has gone on, you start to see more and more like bugs in the system aligning that, and you actually see that like everybody recognizes on some level that voters are incredibly sensitive to the price of energy. You know, that gas goes from like $3.27 to $3.89, and like people start losing their minds, right? And that is telling you that like people worry a lot about climate change, right? A certain set of people do at least, and it causes a fair amount of like stress and anxiety, but there's extremely little like practical willingness to make short-term personal material sacrifices in order to address this issue that feels like very vast and very nebulous kind of thing. And so that's one where like my thinking has turned around on a lot of related issues in terms of how does the whole information ecosystem work, like how does the advocacy landscape work, all those different kinds of things. But I'm sure there's like a million other things I've contradicted myself on over the years. Something I tell people is like, if you do this job for like 25 years and you convince yourself that like all of your takes were correct, like that's just a sign that you're a deluded person, you know? Like you don't want to be wrong constantly, but like if you if by your own assessment you just got everything right, that's like, that's a lack of critical thinking.
Well, in general, I tell my children, I've told students this before too, like, you should be looking back every 5 years and being like, oh, dang, I was an idiot 5 years ago. Like, every
Yeah,
5
I
years,
mean,
you
there's
should
like
evolve.
really obvious ones. Like, so when Trump, when the Republican primary was starting in 2016, it was 2015, right? I was working in a big newsroom. I was running the Politix team for Vox.com, and we had to like assign out different writers to write like capsule profiles of everybody who was running. So the question came of like, who should do Donald Trump? And because he was like a joke candidate, I assigned him to Tess the intern. And she was a great intern, but like, you know, this was a D team assignment because it was stupid. And I was like, I'm going to take Andrew. He's my best guy. He's my young star. He's going to write the Scott Walker one.
I thought you were going to say Jeb Bush.
No. Because somebody else wanted Jeb, but I was like, I got my eye on Scott Walker. Like this is where the smart money is. So
Yeah.
you know that was stupid. Tess did a great job.
All right, let's go to Carter right here in the middle. I don't know everyone's name, but I've known the two back to back, so I'm feeling really good right now.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I just wanted to bring some of the topic back to a little close to home. So you wrote in a recent Substack post that Democrats have been really bullish on winning back the Senate.
Yeah.
The polls haven't really shown a lot of movement yet. You mentioned it might be because some of the effects of Trump's policies haven't really hit yet. But I was just wondering, do the Democrats have a path to win the Senate in your view, and what are those states? I'd really like to hear you talk a little more about Iowa.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a path, right? I mean, the path is North Carolina, where they're clearly favored. The path is Maine, where the polling says that they're favored, although those of us who remember the 2020 and 2008 races know Susan Collins pulls a lot of rabbits out of her hats. Then the path is Alaska, where Democrats have a very strong nominee. And then you need to get one of Ohio, Iowa, Texas. Ohio is like, Democrats are running back Sherrod Brown, former senator. They feel really good about that recruit. I'm a little more, like this is a guy who just lost 2 years ago. And it's not like people didn't know him. They like saw him in office, and the feeling, I don't know Ohio very well, but like what I heard from Ohio swing voters was like, Sherrod's changed. And is he gonna change back into, like, I don't know. Iowa is a state where by the numbers, it should be a pretty good pickup opportunity. It is a state that has swung right decisively, but has a lot of ancestral Democrat. It's easier to get somebody who used to vote for Democrats to vote Democrat again than someone who's never done it in their life. You know, Texas is only a little bit more conservative than Iowa, but Texas doesn't have that ancestry, right? In Texas, to win, Democrats need to get people who not only voted for Trump 3 times, but people who've never voted for a Democrat to do it. In Iowa, you can find people who remember Tom Vilsack and Tom Harkin, people who voted for Barack Obama. And I think Josh Turek has done well with those kinds of voters in his state Senate races, and he could plausibly present himself to these people as, he's not old, but he's an old-fashioned Democrat. He's a throwback. I hope it'll work. But it seems like Zach Walz is more likely to win the nomination. I like Zach a lot. I feel bad every time I need to say this because, like, I know him from the national progressive politics circuit. He's a really nice guy. He's a really smart guy. But by the same token, he's someone who's just been on the national progressive politics circuit, which is, if voters in Iowa wanted somebody like that, I wouldn't be talking about how Iowa swung decisively to the right since 2012. So to me, it's like, it's kind of an obvious one. It's a no-brainer, but like a lot of the donors, the National Interest Group Infrastructure, they like Zach. He's probably going to be the nominee. And then I think that goes off the board, and you're really counting on Ohio.
All right, let's go right up here.
Hi, Matthew. Thank you so much for coming here all the way from DC. So since you've worked with Ezra Klein and people in his political camp, and you've also wrote about rebranding a Democratic Party from radical ideologies to moderate policies, do you think that rebranding involved sort of kind of like abundance policy?
Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe. I mean, I like a lot of the ideas in the abundance book. I also think that book was written to, I think that that's much more about governance, like, which is a very important topic, right? Like, if you are the newly elected governor of New Jersey or Virginia, like, you face the question, like, what am I going to do with my state? And I think the ideas in, like, abundance and the abundance agenda have an incredible amount of relevance to, like, how does Mikey Sherrill become a successful governor of New Jersey? I don't know that it is that much relevance to the question of, like, how do you convince skeptical Republicans in Iowa and Texas that they want to vote for Democrats. I think that like the big party identity stuff is more shaped by cultural issues, you know, and these just kind of questions of like, whose side are you on? What kind of a person would be a Democrat? That kind of thing. Things that are more transparent. These questions about like land use and public sector management and all this other thing, I think is incredibly significant on the substance, but is a little impenetrable in a sort of political campaign context.
Okay, I'm gonna go this way. Is that Jenny? It's Jenny.
Okay, so my question is going back to the talk about the blue dogs.
Yeah.
I find them very interesting and probably the group that most likely fits your moderation idea, but there's a lot of pushback from like the Democratic caucus as a whole. As you mentioned, with like getting Patola, getting support from like the Schumers of the world. I was wondering if you see space for them in 26 or later in 28 to make more of a stand on the national scene, or if you think they'll continue to be like a lesser known, smaller segment of the Democratic caucus.
I mean, you know, it depends what happens, right? I mean, if Peltola's in the Senate, she will have a much larger microphone than she had as a House member. As I say, I'm bullish on Bobby Polito, not just as like a local politician, but as somebody who could be a national figure. I think Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez has stepped up a little bit more in terms of doing kind of national press. I'm gonna miss Jared Golden in Congress, but you know, I hope, but it's a tough one, right? Because it's the philosophy that all those guys have is about like localism, right? It's about the distinctiveness of these different rural communities. Anytime I get a chance to talk to them, like my pitch is you need to like craft like what is the message here? But I moderated a panel last summer in June. And so I had Jared, I had Marie, and I had Adam Gray, Blue Dog from California. And I was like, I kept trying to like pitch stuff to be like, here's like the common thread between the three different kinds of rural districts that you guys represent. And they were like very resistant, you know, and like Representative Gray was like, well, no, I've got like dairy farms and he's got loggers. And I was like, yeah, but like conceptually, you're like working with natural resources. And so I don't know, you know, and it's a question of like, is that strategic for them as individuals? Like probably not, but I think that it helps more in a polarized era. Like politicians will benefit from having sub-brands that are meaningful to people, right? So that a new person could say, well, I'm a Blue Dog Democrat, and then people would know what that is, right? And I think that in the 90s, that meant something to people, and it's fallen into such abeyance that they don't know what it is, and that ultimately like doing the work to make it more recognizable would be helpful. Hopefully helpful not just for like a handful of people winning elections, but to like actually depolarize the country to some extent so that we can get to some of the problem solving, some of like, I think like real change rather than like endless like psychotic pendulum swinging.
I just want to check anyone up at the top want to ask a question. I don't want to leave y'all in the balcony out. No.
Oh yeah,
okay.
Lurking behind the
I
bright
know,
lights.
they're up
That's
there,
like
they're
I
up
didn't
there.
see you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know if you noticed your mic keeps cutting out. Okay, so who else? I know I saw a bunch of hands here, right here. I can't remember your name, but I know I had you an intro like 3 years ago. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. My name's Mia.
Mia, okay, I knew that.
It's okay. Thank you so much for being here. I'm an English and government double major. So on March 16th, you wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times on the toxicity of the Democratic brand in many states. So I'm curious, why do some Democratic politicians avoid openly supporting certain progressive policies?
Why do they avoid it?
Avoid openly supporting certain policies.
I mean, I don't know, I mean, I think one thing is that a lot of progressive policies are not super popular and people shy away from them, I mean, I think on other things, it depends what issue we're talking about exactly. But I also think that a lot of the progressive infrastructure has sort of convinced itself that there's a way to do politics where they deliberately say, well, we're just like not going to talk about certain kinds of issues, but we're also not going to disavow certain kinds of positions. We're just going to kind of like get in and do it, right? And then some people say, no, like we want to see like loud and proud champions of these issues. Other people say like, we're just going to kind of downplay. You look at somebody like Tammy Baldwin, senator from Wisconsin. She has a very progressive voting record, but is not like a spokesperson for progressive causes. If you ever see her on television, she's probably talking about dairy labeling, where like her thing is that you shouldn't be allowed to call almond milk milk, because it's just
Right.
like localist politics. Because like that, she wants to be known in Wisconsin as like the friend of the dairy farmer, but like actually she's very left wing, and that's like a strategy on her part, and not a like cowardice. Really, it's like it's deliberate. Then there's other people. A lot of the former governors, like Jeanne Shaheen and stuff from New Hampshire, who I think actually conceive of themselves as very moderate and have just sort of backed into becoming, I think, like supporting more legislation than they necessarily realized they supported. You had a very weird dynamic in 2021 where like Senator Manchin was like holding back a lot of stuff, but it often felt like there were like 6 or 7 people who quietly agreed with him about everything. So it's a little bit of a murky landscape.
Okay. Sorry, I have a 14-year-old. And you said 6, 7, so I couldn't help it. And then they caught me giggling. So, all right. I know there are more hands. Right here. Oh, right there. I don't know this student.
Hi, I'm Cleo. I'm a philosophy major. I'm a big fan of slow boring. Thank you so much for being
I was a philosophy major, so congratulations. It's the most useful thing you can study.
Yes,
It's like
I agree.
I tell students that all the time. If you want to be a lawyer, you should be a philosophy major.
no, it's at the philosophy factory. They're always hiring. Yeah.
You are obviously writing for Slow Boring now. You've written a lot for the Times. You've co-founded Vox. And one of the things I really appreciate about Substack is I think there are a lot of like takes on the state of the party that like you can't really find in like mainstream outlets like the Times, both more moderate takes or further on the left. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the media landscape and like the advantages of why people should read your Substack.
Oh, yeah. Well, you should read my Substack because it's amazing. Slowboring.com. Check it out. You can get on the free list. You can subscribe and pay me money. It's incredible. So, I think one thing that when I was young, there was a landscape of like small magazines that each kind of stood for very distinctive points on the political spectrum. And I went to work at one at the American Prospect, and I could have really told you then like what was an American Prospect article. And The Nation was a more left-wing magazine, and The New Republic was a more centrist kind of magazine. And Mother Jones was also between The Nation and The New Republic, but we were more like left-wing on labor issues. They were more left-wing on like crunchy kind of environmental issues. Then as my career progressed, we got Facebook, and like things would go viral on Facebook. And we got Google, and things could go viral on Google News. And the mechanics of those platforms, they flattened out the distinctiveness of different publications. People weren't finding articles through publication homepages, and also just viral was viral, right? And so over time, what was in the New Republic, what was in the American Prospect, what was in Slate, what was in Salon, what was in Business Insider, what was in Vox, it became more and more the same. right? Not that every writer was identical to every writer, but publications didn't have distinctiveness. They didn't have distinct identity. And I think that was really bad. It was bad for readers understanding the landscape. It was bad for the career development of young journalists who couldn't learn from like-minded people or understand how worldviews function. And so a lot of what's happened on Substack, I started my own thing. There's a lot of other kind of, solo author stuff out there. But then there's also things like my friend Jerusalem has The Argument, which is like a staff and stands for a certain kind of politics. Zeteo stands for a different kind of politics. The Bulwark stands for a different kind of politics. The Free Press stands for a different kind of politics. And all of those are small publications that exist on Substack where I could tell you, what is an article for this publication versus that publication? What's the zone of overlap? What's the zone of difference, right? And that kind of recreating of diversity and heterogeneity in the media landscape, I just think is really important for people who really want to engage with ideas in a deep and serious way. It's fine that lots of people don't want to engage with ideas in a deep and serious way, but for a while we had an ecosystem that wasn't serving the people who did, and I think that we're trying to rebuild that now in this less still using the internet to distribute content, but not depending on that kind of virality and platform distribution.
Okay. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Oh my gosh, this table is just one right after another on fire.
That's the stars, yeah.
The stars.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I'm Mara. I'm a Global Studies and Spanish double major. And you talked before about how many Democrat politicians have kind of shied away from issues in identity politics, such as trans inclusion in sports. Do you think that the more successful route that Democrats can take is by having a more left position on, like you said before, labor issues, such as universal health care and things like that, versus taking the route of many contesting identity politics that might sway away outside voters?
I think that kind of the winning sweet spot for progressive politics in America is usually by trying to have a unifying message, right? Not one that's ignoring these kind of questions of race and gender and sexuality that come up time and again in American politics, but one that's saying that these are things that have been used to divide people against each other, and that we're putting forward a platform that's going to bring people together and is going to lift everybody up together. There's some great lines in Martin Luther King's final book, which is called Chaos or Community, and he is talking about how he's using some old-fashioned language, but he's saying we're going to have excellent schools for Negroes when we have excellent schools for everyone. Right? And that's his pitch. And I think that's sort of the winning way, right? Is to talk about how are we going to have a society that lifts everybody up and that is inclusive, by definition, but not inclusive in a sense of like a laundry list of you need to use these words, you need to talk in this kind of way, we need to shout out, every kind of small constituency versus a comprehensive vision of a better country that works for everyone.
Over here, new table.
Hi, I'm Andrew. I'm a global studies major. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. So there's 2 sort of really nationally covered popular mayors right now. One is, of course, Ron Mondani in New York, and the other one is San Francisco Mayor Daniel Lurie, who has sort of embraced a more moderate agenda. And obviously, San Francisco struggled a lot with homelessness and addiction during the pandemic, but he's very, very popular, and I'm curious to see if you think the sort of more local policies that he's focusing on instead of more national issues, do you think that can be implemented in other parts of the country throughout the 2026 midterm cycle?
Yeah, Mayor Lurie is really interesting. If people don't know about him, he was elected after. I think people in San Francisco just really got sick and tired of the level of sort of open drug use that was happening on the streets and petty crime. You know, there was an incredible amount of break-ins to people's cars, break-ins to people's homes, things like that. So he won a mayor election, and critically, what happened at the same time is that a couple of like-minded people got elected to the Board of Supervisors. Because mayor of San Francisco is not a very strong office. His predecessor, London Breed, had frankly a lot of similar ideas to Mayor Lurie's, but she was very ineffective. And he has been able to get a lot done because he's had majorities there on the council. Mayor Mamdani, I think, has almost benefited from the opposite dynamic, which is that he doesn't have support on the council for some of his more like out there ideas. And so he has been forced to actually focus a lot of attention on like basic service delivery and doing stuff and just like being visibly out there, like taking care of the snow. He rolled out some new things so that to make it like easier for people to know where childcare centers in their neighborhood are. Like he's like a very smart and hardworking person, and energy matters a lot in a mayor. But he can, you know, this sort of macro political context can make a real difference. Like if people want certain kinds of big sweeping changes, then it's really helpful to have a legislature behind you. I think in his case, it's kind of almost worked out the other way. You know, and I can tell you in Washington, D.C., we've had a mayor, she's run year 12 now. I voted for her in all her elections. I agree with her about stuff, but she is not a high energy person in the way that Mamdani and Lurie both are. She's not like visibly out there rolling up her sleeves and attacking problems in the city. And it's bad, like it's frustrating. I keep hoping we'll get somebody like way better because people like to see those local officials like doing the frontline work, you know, out there aggressively, because I talked a long time ago to Martin O'Malley, who was the governor of Maryland, but before that he was the mayor of Baltimore. And what he explained to me was that like you have limited power over civil service, like in reality. You know, these are people with sort of protected jobs, but there are things you can do as a mayor to like get the derelict cars cleaned up, to get the trash picked up. But it requires this kind of constant engagement, right? It's not, you're not gonna pass a law that's like, and now they really will fill the potholes, right? Like the law already says they're supposed to fill the potholes, but it's like, are they doing it, right? It just requires this 24/7 input that's totally different from how like members of Congress and state legislators approach their jobs, which is all about like which bills am I co-sponsoring, which position do I take, rather than like what am I doing?
All right, so we've got just a little bit more time, and I want to wrap it up by touching back on Maine politics just a little bit.
All right, we're back.
So Maine is considered kind of one of the last strongholds for true moderate and crossover voters, as we've talked about a little bit already. And as it is a midterm year, we have a really unique Senate race shaping up, starting in the Democratic primary with Graham Plattner and Janet Mills. So you've also talked previously on Slow Boring, your Substack, about Collins's like surprisingly strong grasp of her Senate seat. So if you were a betting man, what's your prediction for this election, and what do you think we should watch out for?
So I mean, I looked at the betting odds yesterday, and I think it was like 77% Democrats. That seems high to me. I mean, I don't know that I would put Collins above 50%, but I would sell at 77, just because we've seen her win before. We've seen her win before when the polling said that she was losing. I don't think that, you know, Mills and Plattner both have strengths as politicians, but neither of them seems really ideal, really optimal. She broke with Trump on the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. She broke with Trump on his second impeachment, things like that. She's had a real record of independent-mindedness that has delivered for her in the past. Now, you know, Republicans may just be so unpopular by November that she's sunk. This war does not seem to be working out well. We do not know what the president is saying tonight because we are here. So, like, maybe the war will end tomorrow and these problems will solve themselves. But I think I can't count her out.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.